Hi, and welcome to episode 74 of Middle Eastern Islamic History. We've been doing this since July of 2021, so we've come a long way. And today we're going to talk about modern Lebanon, basically the tail end of this Lebanese civil war and what came afterwards. So the rules, for those of you who are not familiar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in religion, philosophy, or any of the subjects that we are going to be discussing tonight. That said, this is going to try to be a secular presentation, not trying to draw favoritism to either side in this multi-polar situation. And of course, like all the other episodes in Middle Eastern Islamic history, this will be controversial, so let's be respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. And if you prefer to speak out, at the end of the 2 hours during the Q&A session, I will be unmuting people so that way they can talk. But I will respond to the chat in real time in the presentation. What I like to say is these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning 101, if you already know something, if you don't know anything, I'll tell you something and you'll be on course. And 201, meaning that if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. I cut off at 2 hours. Recently, I've been a little flaky about that, but I brought my watch, so that's not going to happen tonight. When I put dates below a person, if they're a politician, those are their years of service. If I put it down below a thought leader, that's usually their dates of life. And this is recorded like the other 73 episodes in this series, as well as all the things that we do for History Mostly Ancient Discussions. These are recorded and you can watch them later on our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page and you can see all the episodes from all of our series. Really exciting stuff. And we would encourage you to join our meetup if you want to be part of the live Zoom. So that way you can ask your questions and understand a little bit more about Middle Eastern history. And that said, if you like what we do, we have premium Zoom, premium YouTube, premium meetup, and all those things cost money. So if you like what we do, if you respect what we do, please send us a few donations to sort of keep the lights on. Otherwise, this is still free, and I hope you enjoy it. So as we talked about last time, we have a number of patterns to notice with Lebanon, and these patterns will only get more developed as we enter the latter stages, right? We talked about how Lebanon is sort of at the crossroads of the Arab Cold War, meaning that there are two really strong factions in the Arab Cold War. One is sort of a Western-aligned monarchies and Western-aligned republics. So that's the monarchies like the Gulf monarchies and Jordan, republics like Israel, Cyprus, and Turkey. And then on the other side, you have the Arab socialist states like Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Of course, as we move past the year 1979, Egypt becomes part of the Western sphere in a huge sense because of Anwar Sadat's realignment, that we talked about in episode 69. And Syria, although it is Arab socialist in terms of its governing political party, has also undergone that Caudiyoization, has sort of stripped all of the political philosophy out of its Ba'ath party. And we're going to see those two groups trying to carve up Lebanon in some sort of way. And there's going to be a tension because of that between the sort of more Western-aligned identities, especially among the Maronite population, and the more Arab-aligned identities of the Sunni and Shiite Muslim populations. We're also going to see that Lebanon is going to be carved up in a lot of feudal states. And when we talk about the Lebanese Civil War, it's very comforting, but false, to imagine it as this place where there's a large battlefield and the troops are standing together, something like the American Civil War, and they just fire on each other, right? And you have two very strong contiguous territories that are fighting over their border regions or major cities, and then they move on. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that you have a patchwork quilt of this town or this block or this area is controlled by this militia, and then the next militia controls a different block, and there's a checkpoint between them, and then there's a different militia, and then there's a different militia. And as you can see from this map from 1986 to 1987, which is towards the tail end of the Lebanese Civil War, this is an oversimplified map of the different militia controls, and even there you can see that territories are not necessarily unified. territories are not necessarily controlling even entire cities. You can see Beirut is divided right down the middle between the western side controlled by the Amal, which is a Shiite militia, and the eastern side controlled by the Lebanese government, by which they mean the Maronite-dominated government at that time. And so we should understand that this is a place where every few miles you'll have a different checkpoint, and every few miles there'll be a different government. And so you'll have shells everywhere, and people are trying to live their normal lives in this very disruptive, chaotic situation. And of course, we're going to always be discussing the religious balance in in Lebanon, between Maronites, other Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, Druze, and talking about how those different groups play into each other, while also remembering that in many cases, there's going to be intra-ethnic strife. So there might be a Maronite group X and a Maronite group Y that don't like each other because of political wrangling. One of the things that we saw last time, for example, was the fighting between Bashir Gemayel, who led one Maronite militia, the Phalangists, and Dani Shamon, who led a different Maronite militia. And basically, Bashir Gemayel attacked Dani Shamon's militia in order to try and co-opt it and have it join his own. So you had a Maronite on Maronite conflict, and we're going to see that develop as well as we move through this discussion. All right. And I just wanted to sort of point that out again. I love this Battle of Ain Dara from 1711, of course, long before the period we're discussing. But again, it shows that you have elements of the same ethnic group on both sides of the conflict, and you have them all assembling their own coalitions of groups that fight with them. So, right, you have the Jumblats on the Qaisi side, and the Jumblats are a Druze faction, and on the Yemeni faction, the Alauddin, the Arslan, and the Sawah are all also Druze factions. So you have Druze versus Druze. The Shihab dynasty at this time is a Sunni Arab dynasty, but you also have other groups that are Maronite or otherwise on each side of this divide, right? The Ottoman governors of Sidon and Damascus are also Sunni. So just because a person is from X group or Y group doesn't mean that they are necessarily going to be aligned with other members or other factions from their group. In fact, what we're going to see is increasingly that those ethnic groups are going to be less unifying, and vision becomes more unifying. And one thing I want to point out, because it's going to come up later, is that when we talk about Mount Lebanon, that central area within this black dotted line here, where you can see that the majority of the inhabitants are either Maronite or Druze, the history of that territory is one that's going to be rewritten and re-understood and recontextualized during this Lebanese civil war over 120 years later. And the reason that is that you have Maronites coming into power, like Bashir Shihab II, that you see here in the 19th century, as a Maronite ruler over what had consistently been areas where the Druze were the landowners and the Maronites were the sharecroppers. So that relationship becomes upended by Bashir Shihab not only becoming the leader of Mount Lebanon, but being able to decisively defeat Druze factions. And because of the French intervention in the Lebanese Civil War of 1860, 120 years ago, the Maronites were able to assert an advantage over the Druze in the long term. We also saw that the Maronite-French relationship resulted in the creation of Greater Lebanon, that territory that included a number of Sunni Muslim and Shiite Muslim regions outside of the mountain that increasingly wanted to form a distinct country. And this Greater Lebanon would ultimately lead to the development of that national pact, right? That idea that the president has to be a Maronite, the prime minister has to be a Sunni, the speaker of the parliament needs to be a Shiite, but that a significant number of powers would be reserved in the presidency. And the National Pact also allowed for the creation of a cabinet and other government facilities that could be appointed by the president. So in effect, while the deputies in the parliament were mixed according to the different populations of the different ethnic groups, the Maronites held a disproportionate share of power. And during this time in Lebanon, the politics worked out in a way that was very positive. And it was very positive specifically because the independence of the state of Israel effectively meant that the Arab countries lost their primary Mediterranean export port, which had been Haifa. And so they shifted to using Beirut. And so Beirut became the center of Arab exports to the West and Western imports to the Arab world. And in that position, Beirut was able to become a center of trade and development. The West also invested heavily in Beirut because Beirut was an area, unlike a lot of the other cities in the Middle East, that had a very distinctly European vibe to it. It had a modern vibe that Europeans could feel more naturally at home in. And so they felt like it was a good idea to build their companies there. And to combine all of this, the Lebanese financial system was revolutionized by Intrabank and a number of other smaller banks that allowed for Arabs to get their finances out of their home countries and into a stable situation, and it allowed Europeans to bring their money into the Middle East. And this inflow of capital led to a golden age in Lebanon, where Lebanon was considered the Paris of the East. But of course, in 1966, as we talked about, the Intrabank needed a loan from the Lebanese government in order to cover some of its shortfalls. It had enough money on its books, according to reports, to overcome that. They just needed time to shift it. But the Lebanese government decided to not float the bank, to not give that loan. And so that ultimately doomed Intrabank to closure. And the collapse of Intrabank led to most Arab monarchs not seeing the Lebanese economy as stable and putting their money in European banks, like in Switzerland. And it led to European dissatisfaction with Lebanon as a financial station, leading to them pulling their money out of Lebanon. And so this was a case where the goose that laid the golden egg was killed. And there are a few reasons why the Lebanese government didn't want to provide Yusuf Beidas the funds that he would have needed. The first is that he was a Palestinian, and being a Palestinian was a touchy subject in Lebanon, because Palestinians, due to the fact that they were Sunni Muslims, might upset the carefully constructed 6-to-5 ratio of the National Pact, putting Christians in majority, and it might undermine the claims of the presidency to be a Maronite, and for Lebanon to be a country that, while incorporating its Muslim population, gave deference to its Maronite population. There was also the fact that Yusuf Beidas had grown up during the British Mandate of Palestine. He grew up in Jerusalem as a Palestinian, and his dominant foreign language and his dominant commercial association was with the English. Many of the leaders in Lebanon had grown up during the French Republican period, the French Mandatory period, and therefore their associations were with France. And so they spoke French, and the high society was different. And so Yusuf Beidas was simply culturally excluded. They didn't feel a connection to him. And then finally, Yusuf Beidas used a certain percentage of the revenue that he'd been generating from creating this bank to support the Palestinian Fedayeen, which further led into fears that those Palestinian Fedayeen would, as they eventually did, try to topple or somehow alter the arrangement that existed under the National Pact in Lebanon. And what we see throughout the 1960s is that the Palestinians become more and more incensed that they don't have agency in the future determining of their own lives. Within Lebanon, few of them have permission to work. Most of them don't have permission to move outside of their refugee camps. And so they are constrained. This, however, with the resulting funding for their militias coming from individuals like Beidas, coming from individuals in the Gulf that wanted to create an independent Palestinian state, or at least cause problems for Israel, these groups began to become better funded and better organized than anything the Lebanese government could deal with. And that, combined with Black September in Jordan, meant that the Palestinian leadership was leaving Jordan and coming to Lebanon. So Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt, negotiated what was called the Cairo Accord, that basically allowed the Palestinians to create their own militias and create their own state within a state in Lebanon without interference from the Lebanese government. And then we talked about how the reaction to this from a lot of the Maronites was incredible fear. Fear that they would lose their position, fear that they would become like other Christian minorities throughout the Middle East, discriminated against and eliminated on their home front. And so there was an election in 1970, the closest presidential election Lebanon has ever had, where the deputies, of course, vote for the president, and so Suleiman Fangia won by literally one deputy's vote, as opposed to Elias Sarkis, who was more in favor of a unified Muslim-Christian approach. Suleiman Fangia was in favor of keeping the Christians in their point of power because of the real threat of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and other militias that were Muslim aligned might upset the agreements between the two parties. And now, as we started the war in Lebanon, and we talked about this last time, the war primarily started because of a number of interactions within Beirut between the Palestinian militias and the Phalangist or Maronite-oriented militias. And these militias were spurred on by the Palestinian Liberation Army, which was a Syrian army. Remember, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is Yasser Arafat's Palestinian aligned entity, and this Palestinian Liberation Army is a creation of Bashar al-Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, in Syria, made of Palestinians, but sent to Lebanon on the purpose of being what was effectively a false flag army. And in the beginning, most of the Christian factions actually requested the Syrians to intervene, believing that the Syrians would bring calm to the situation, which was, generally speaking, moving in the favor of these Muslim militants. And the Syrians did intervene. But 1 year after they did, they changed sides. And the way that they changed sides was through the act of the Arab Deterrent Force. They wanted to create a force that would supposedly represent the entire Arab League and its decisions regarding the future of Lebanon. Notice, however, that if it's the Arab League making the decision about what's going to happen to Lebanon, it's going to have a decidedly Arab character in terms of the result. And one of the fights that had been going on at the time of the National Pact in 1943 was whether Lebanon would be a Western aligned country, or it would that would be Lebanon as a distinct entity, or it would be part of the Arab world. And so an Arab deterrent force naturally is falling into the Arab-speaking world. There's a question here of if the distinction between the PLA and the PLO still exists. The PLA doesn't really exist today, but there are some camps of the PLA, but the PLO is the dominant entity. And the PLO itself is fragmented because of the creation of the Palestinian Authority in 1994. So Fatah was the main inheritor of the PLO legacy. Many of the other militias like the DFLP and the PFLP and these militias have generally gone by the wayside or have very low membership. So, as I was saying, so you had this Syrian request for the Arab Deterrent Force, and the Arabs all agreed that there would be an Arab Deterrent Force, but it was made of over 80% Syrians, and after a few years, it became 100%, as most of the other countries that had donated a few troops there, a few troops here, pulled out due to the logistics issues and due to lack of desire to see their own soldiers killed. Now, Hafez al-Assad, who was the reigning Syrian president at this time, the view that there was no distinction between Lebanon or Syria. He's quoted in a speech as saying, there's more difference between certain states in the United States than there is between Lebanon and Syria. We are one nation, we are one people. And the lack of recognition of Lebanon is something that will sort of carry through Syrian politics from the 1970s onward. Life during the Lebanese Civil War was complicated in that different militias controlled different regions, and yet people still had to live their normal lives in the middle of this chaos. So you had checkpoints between different regions that people would cross or not cross. The city of Beirut was literally divided in half between the Muslim West and the Maronite East. But you also had different groups sort of working together to try and make things work. You can see this is on the right-hand side. It's a Lebanese militia. This is actually a Muslim-oriented militia, but they're putting up a Christmas tree because some of their allies are Maronites, and so they want to celebrate Christmas with them. And so you have people trying to persevere through this. Of course, it should go without saying that a significant portion of Lebanese also emigrated because of the war. And the Lebanese diaspora swelled during this time. In fact, today, there's actually probably more Lebanese or Lebanese descended people in Brazil than there are in Lebanon itself. One of the things that develops during the Syrian foray into Lebanon happened actually at the very start of hostilities, even before the conflict in 1973. When when Hafez al-Assad was looking for legitimacy in Syria, he, under the third article of the Syrian constitution, the religion of the president of the republic is Islam. And as an Alawite, many Syrians believe, and I would second their belief, that he is not a Muslim. Now, I don't believe that the Syrian president should be chosen based on his religion, but as an Alawite, he had difficulty demonstrating that he fit this credential. And so he reached out to Sayyid Musa al-Sadr, and al-Sadr granted Assad the claim that Alawites are actually a part of Shiite Islam, and therefore Hafez al-Assad is a true Muslim in line with the constitution. And because of this relationship that Hafez al-Assad had created with As-Sadr, this brought him increasingly into the Shiite kind of influence. And so when Iran became an Islamic Republic in 1979, ruled by a Shiite clergy, Syria was a natural ally of its efforts. And so Hafez al-Assad became a close ally of Ruhollah Khomeini. Now, if we remember from our discussion of modern Syria, Syria was an abjectly secular government. And to the extent that there were Muslims in government, they were overwhelmingly Sunni. Now, the dominant force in his government were Alawite, but those Alawites were not chosen by religious fervor or religious idealism. They were chosen simply because they were effective at implementing Hafez al-Assad's orders. So it would appear at first glance that a theocrat and such an ardent secularist being such close allies would be anomalous, but Syria needed Iran as a potential backer, and Iran liked Syria as a potential way to get to the Mediterranean. And so you have this power projection by Iran using Syria in order to establish position on the Mediterranean. And there's one other benefit that Syria conferred upon Iran, which is that they could box Iraq in. And Iraq was fighting a long-term conflict against Iran from 1980 until 1988. So anything that Syria could do to assist in that process was greatly appreciated by Iran. And so because of this Syrian-Iran alliance, Iran is going to take an interest in the politics of Lebanon, the politics that are going on during this civil war. And Iran is going to support, alongside Syria, but as the dominant power, Hezbollah, which is going to be this new Islamist group in Lebanon that has a Shiite bent. we've seen before that there are Shiite militias that are already operating in Lebanon, but the Shiites are rather weak in the 1970s in Lebanon. They're relatively impoverished compared especially to the Maronites and the Sunnis, and they are generally ignored despite being over 20% of the population, which makes them the third largest faction in the country. Now, the Amal group, despite strongly identifying as sectarianly Shiite and their usage of Musa as-Sadr as their spiritual icon, were relatively secular in their outlook, and their primary goal was economic enfranchisement. So they allowed non-Shiites to join their militia. It just happened that not many did. And so we end up having this sort of conflict develop between Hezbollah, which is more theocratic in orientation, and the Amal movement, which is more secular in orientation. And we also have them fighting, at least in the beginning, to make the economic argument that they're looking out for the poor, undeveloped population of Lebanon. In the years around 1978 as well, we begin to see Israeli influence in the conflict, especially as the IDF meets with the South Lebanon Army and what's called the Good Neighbor policy starts. So in 1978, Israel reaches out to a Maronite militia called the South Lebanon Army, and the South Lebanon Army agrees with the Israelis that a relationship should be forged and that the border with Israel should be made secure. So the area between the Litani River and the Israeli border, you can see on the map between the light blue lines and the dark blue line, becomes under the control of the South Lebanon Army, which is heavily supported by Israel. And the primary function of this is to ensure that the southern areas that are close to Israel don't see Palestinians who are able to penetrate the border and attack Israelis, as several of them had tried to do. And in fact, we talked about Dalal Mughrabi, who was the last so-called Fida'i, right, who tried to cross the border into Israel, but she tried to do it the novel way of taking a boat to Tel Aviv and coming on shore that way. Her attack resulted in over 70 deaths, including her own. But the important point here is that Israel begins to become increasingly involved, increasingly dragged into the conflict in Lebanon in a way that it wasn't originally intending. And that gets fully amplified in 1981 with Operation Peace of the Galilee, which is the Israeli code name for their invasion of southern Lebanon, beyond the territory that was controlled by the South Lebanon Army. Now, the Israeli leadership at this point had recently signed the peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, and they believed that Lebanon would probably be the next country to sign a peace treaty with Israel because they saw in Lebanon many similarities with Israel. They saw it as a non-Muslim-led country with some Muslims in it, fighting against Muslim and Arab hordes from the outside, and that, accordingly, Israel would be a good ally for them in the long term. And Israelis at this point were also of the mindset that they could begin to, in almost a neoconservative way, create a Lebanon that would be friendly to them. And that was what was sold to both the Israeli public and the Israeli leadership. Ariel Sharon in particular, who was defense minister, established a very strong relationship with Bashir Gemayel, who was the leading commander of the Phalange, which was one of the Maronite militias. Bashir Gemayel was of the view that Israel was a useful ally in dealing with the Syrians, because increasingly the Syrians had shown that their favoritism was not towards the Maronites, on whose request they had intervened in Lebanon, but on the side of the Sunni and increasingly Shiite Muslims. And using Israel, he would effectively be able to get the Syrians out of the country and create a new Lebanon, a Lebanon that would be based on a Maronite political ascendancy. And we should take a second to think about what that means, in that the National Pact had been a pact between Christians and Muslims about the future of a country that they shared. Now, to say it was a perfect convivencia would be lying, but there was interest from both sides in that arrangement. The arrangement that Bashir Gemayel was creating, and this was really the first time that it had been truly articulated in Lebanese politics, was one where the defining vision of the country was as Lebanese with Arab links, which is much weaker than saying saying that Lebanon is both an Arab and saying that Lebanon has Arab components. And it's a view that holds that any objection to the Lebanese-ness of the country is being created from the outside, regardless of whether that is an internal critique or an external critique. And Lebanese-ness is often identified using Maronite symbols. In a way, the Lebanon that he was trying to create in many ways mirrors what Israel had declared itself to be up to that point, right? Instead of being a Jewish state, it was now a Maronite state in all but name. And as the Israeli casualties began to mount, in fact, Israel would lose over 500 soldiers in Lebanon, the Israelis invaded Beirut in order to secure that Bashir Gemayel would be elected as the next president of Lebanon in 1982. His detractors, both among Maronites and among non-Maronites, often called him the president of the tanks, because without those Israeli tanks, he probably wouldn't have gotten elected. So, but regardless of the fact that he got elected, he never actually became president because he was assassinated on September the 14th, 1982. Now, the Israelis Sharon told Bashir Gemayel that it was Palestinians that did it. Later evidence seems to suggest that it was Shiite militants connected with Syria. Regardless, because his view, the view was that by the Lebanese forces that Bashir Gemayel was assassinated by Palestinians, two Palestinian refugee camps based in Beirut, Sabra and Shatila, were subject to massacres by the Palestinian population, and the Israeli soldiers who were in control of that region of Beirut did not intervene as the Palestinians were being massacred. Both Sharon and Lebanese militias have been held accountable, at least in courts, whether or not those verdicts have actually had effect, for the massacres against those Palestinian civilians. One of the difficulties here in sort of ascribing guilt is that in many cases, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was operating in a number of these camps to oppose the Israelis. And one of the Israeli objectives, in addition to getting Gemayel elected, was that they would expel the Palestinian Liberation Organization from Lebanon entirely, just as Jordanians had expelled them from Jordan. And so that became part of what Israel was seeking to do in the long term. And there was a question of how did Sharon acquire those tanks? More broadly, how did Israel acquire such great military capabilities over time? It's a complicated question, and I think I tried to address it when we talked about Israel in episode 63 and 64. But I think the simplest answer is that the Israelis were able to, by this point, by the 1980s, solidify a military alliance with the United States. And that military alliance allowed Israel to buy weapons from the US government at a greatly reduced price, and incorporate those weapons into its military arsenal. Additionally, most of Israel's generals were extremely battle-hardened. Sharon himself had served in 67 and in 73 as a commander in Israel's wars in those years. And so his ability to command and organize troops was much better than many other generals similarly situated in other Middle Eastern countries, because his rise was meritocratic, whereas in a lot of other Middle Eastern countries, generals and colonels and other higher leaders in the military are appointed nepotistically. Syria is a great example of this, right? Where Hafiz al-Assad is choosing Alawites because they'll be loyal to him rather than the most effective military commanders he could have. You also have to realize that there's a differential between the size of the militias and the size of a national army. The Phalangists under Gemayel, which were probably the largest single militia in Lebanon, had a grand total of about 5,000 members. The Israeli military was significantly larger than that, as was the Syrian military. So after Bashir Gemayel was assassinated on the 14th of September, his brother Amin Gemayel was sworn in as president. And this began the US-sponsored attempt to broker a peace between the Lebanese government under Amin Gemayel and the Israelis. For Amin Gemayel, the most important thing to acquire through a peace treaty with Israel was the full removal of Israeli troops from Lebanon. Amin Gemayel believed that any foreign forces in Lebanon would be compromising on its long-term security and stability. And accordingly, in order for Lebanon to be a Lebanese state, as his brother would have wanted, Israel had to go. Israel had two major demands of Lebanon in addition to normalization of relations. One of them was that the Palestine Liberation Organization be expelled, as I mentioned earlier. And the other one was that they wouldn't leave until the Syrians did. And this, of course, was a no-go. Amin Gemayel believed that the Syrians were part of an Arab deterrent force and should be subject to the discussions within the wider Arab world. Just as he was negotiating with the United States, the leader of the Western countries concerning Israel, he should negotiate with the Arab countries concerning Syria. And so those two things shouldn't be tagged together. The Israelis were supposed to leave. They weren't supposed to negotiate about when they would leave, or if they would leave, or how they would leave. Another corollary here is that the Israelis wanted a certain degree of control, if not full control, over Lebanese defense policy. So what would that mean in practice? It would mean in practice that Israel could control who Lebanon went to war with or not, who Lebanon maintained relations with or not. And from Amin Gemayel's perspective, this looked very much like the creation of a client state. And so while the parliament approved the May 17th agreement, Amin Gemayel refused to sign it. And within a year or so, he repudiated it directly, meaning that it was a dead letter, even though it had been signed. However, one of the Israeli objectives, despite not getting a peace treaty with Lebanon, was achieved. The Palestinian Liberation Organization agreed to leave Lebanon. And so a multinational force composed primarily of American and French soldiers arrived in Beirut to escort the PLO out in August of 1982. And they continued their operations in the country, trying to serve as peacekeepers until 1983. Now, in 1983, there was a fundamental shift that occurred. As Iran became more and more involved, right, they had formed their alliance with Syria in 1982. And so by 1983, they were beginning to directly lead organizations in their operations and funding. And an organization called the International Jihad Organization. We don't know what organization this actually is. It's considered by many to be a forerunner to Hezbollah, which was officially founded in 1985, attacked the U.S. Marine barracks with 2 suicide bombers. These bombers killed 283 American servicemen, which caused the United States to withdraw most of its forces. Now, they came back to Lebanon a little bit later, but they withdrew again. From the American perspective, this peacekeeping force was a failure, as Lebanon spiraled back out of control, and Amin Gemayel was trying to consolidate the power that he did hold. Now, Amin Gemayel began to implement, to a large degree, the vision of his brother. Less effectively, since he was significantly less charismatic, but Lebanon effectively became a Maronite state, or a state where Maronites were primus inter pares, as opposed to the previous national pact, where all the three dominant ethnic groups and the other subsidiary groups have a role to play in the organization of the state. And so we start having these discussions occur in the context of the Lebanese Civil War of what the Lebanese convivencia is going to be. Is it going to be a nation of the Lebanese, right? Is it going to be some sort of Maronite-dominated society? Or is it going to be something else? Is it going to be, for example, an Arab society? If it's an Arab society, who gets to define what an Arab is and who are members of this Arab world? What's the relationship between the Christian and Muslim populations and between the different Muslim populations themselves? And what we effectively see is that a portion of the Maronites, led by Ali Hobeika, and a number of the Muslim groups, especially the Druze led by Walid Jumblat of the Progressive Socialist Party, and Nabi Berri of Amal, which was the dominant Shiite party at the time, right? Because Hezbollah hadn't yet really entered the scene, met in Damascus. Now, Ali Hobeika was part of the Lebanese forces. He was part of the same organization that effectively Amin Gemayel was supposed to be leading. So you can imagine how this was viewed as sort of a treachery, ripping apart the Maronite Lebanese forces. But Hobeika felt that under an agreement with Walid Jumblat and Nabi Berri, he could possibly gain more power for himself and for those who were directly loyal to him. So after serving, and in fact, he was, just to show his bona fides from before, he was part of the Sabra and Shatila massacres. So he was part of the Lebanese Phalangist force that had been so virulently anti-Palestinian, but now he's switching sides because of the convenience of it. And so in 1985, in 28th December, in Damascus, Hafez al-Assad convenes these three individuals to create a new tripartite pact. And this pact would create a blueprint for a Lebanon that they imagined. It would be a Lebanon divided by sectarian differences, with a number of different mechanisms to ensure equality between the Muslims and the Christians, such that there would be half of the deputies Muslim, half of the deputies Christian, for example, in the parliament. And you had a situation where this blueprint, of course, was roundly rejected by Amin Gemayel. Hafez al-Assad engaged in numerous negotiations with Amin Gemayel, and Gemayel said to him point blank that if the Muslims have an equal vote in the country, they will seek to undermine all of the protections that the Maronites have. And he pointed to the situation of Christians in other countries in the Middle East and how much it had deteriorated under Muslim control. That was simply not something that he could allow, not something that he could afford to subject his population to. And further to this, there was another secret part of the tripartite agreement that came out in the negotiations with Amin Gemayel, which is that this second republic that Hafez Assad was contemplating would eventually give way to a third republic. And the third republic would not have any sectarian boundaries at all, meaning that a Muslim or a Christian could be elected for whatever seat based on population. And while that sounds good in theory, you have to remember that the number of Christians that were emigrating was much higher than the number of Muslims who were emigrating, usually because Christians had better access to the means to emigrate. And the number of Muslims was growing just at a birth rate level much more quickly than Christians. So the Christians already knew that they were probably less than half the population, and that was set to continue to deteriorate. So in this third republic of Hafez al-Assad's imagining, the Christians would become very quickly a less than a one-third or less minority in the country of Lebanon, both politically and socially, and it would put their future stake in the country in jeopardy. And so Amin Gemayel rejected this proposal. Now you can see from the other side, from especially the Druze and the Shiites, who were looking for an equal bite at the table, bite at the apple, especially since when it comes to the Druze, they had a historic position of being empowered maybe 300 years ago. And the Shiites in that they were never empowered and that they didn't know what it was like to be empowered. In fact, the Shiites in Amal had actually been pro-Israeli for the first few weeks of the Israeli invasion because the Israelis took care of the Sunnis who were oppressing them, the Sunnis being mostly Palestinian gangs and thugs. And so during the 1980s, rather than going through the internecine squabbles over random pieces of territory in Lebanon, I wanted to sort of paint general pictures of what's happening in this time period. And the first major issue that we see is that the Sunnis are weakening. And there are a few reasons for this. The first one is that the Palestinians were the dominant Sunni contingent in the Lebanese civil war. They were the largest militia that was Sunni aligned, and they were expelled. In 1983, they all left, and they were in Tunisia or Algeria. They were outside of the military apparatus. They couldn't do anything anymore. The next thing is that many important Sunni leaders had either gone into exile or been executed. There were a number of assassinations, especially throughout in the latter part of the Lebanese civil war, and these assassinations disproportionately targeted Sunni leaders. Not to say that other groups weren't targeted either, right? We just talked about Bashir Gemayel, who was probably the most important assassination since it was a president-elect of the country. But these sorts of acts weakened the influence of the Sunni leadership. And there was really only one Sunni militia that existed, and that militia, the Murabitun, was forcibly disbanded by Walid Jumblat. And while Walid Jumblat was a Druze, he disbanded it probably at the Syrians' orders. So the Sunnis start to play less and less of a viable role in the long-term development of the civil war. The next thing is that with the rise of Hezbollah, the Shiites start a reshuffling dance. So Amal, which was originally for the downtrodden, now shifted its focus to middle-class Shiites, and Hezbollah became the dominant voice of the poor. One of the strange things here is that because Hezbollah became more radical in its approach, it was seen as being more authoritative on Shiite concerns. And so Hezbollah becomes more and more prominent than Amal among the Shiite communities, especially the disenfranchised ones, promising retribution against Israel. This becomes particularly potent after 1985, because in 1985, Israel withdraws from the vast bulk of Lebanese territory and stays south of the Litani River, where the South Lebanon Army, its proxy, was in control. And since most of the Shiite majority areas were now liberated, in the sense of they no longer had Israeli tanks on them, Amal was willing to sort of make a peace with Israel to a certain degree. Not so with Hezbollah. Hezbollah made the argument that they would not stop attacking the Israelis until the Israelis had given up every single inch of Lebanese territory. And for this, I'm going to take an aside to something that's much further in the future, but there's really no good place to put it other than here. And this is the Shebaa Farms controversy. So in the year 2000, Israel completely withdraws, according to the UN definition, from Lebanon, all the way to what's called the Blue Line, which is the border between Israel and Lebanon, as that border existed in 1949. Now, there is a small territory that Israel controls called the Shebaa Farms. They're called that because people in the Lebanese town of Shebaa used to go there and farm the land, but there's no major cities on that territory, maybe some small towns. And it's unclear from the historical maps whether this territory belongs to Lebanon or to Syria. But when Israel took it in 1967, they took it from Syria. And so from the Israeli perspective, it was former Syrian territory and now integrated into its northern Galilee region under the annexation law of 1981. From the Syrian perspective, they say that it's Lebanese, although they can't produce a single document to defend that assertion. And from the Lebanese perspective, there's a huge debate. those like Hezbollah, who want to say that Israel has not vacated every inch of Lebanese territory, argue that the Shabbat farms are Lebanese, and therefore Israel has not vacated every inch of Lebanese territory. Groups that are more prone to making peace or non-aggression with Israel, let's say, especially like the Lebanese Front, have argued that no, Israel has withdrawn from all of Lebanon as of the year 2000, and that the Shabbat farms are part of Syria. And so you see these sort of back and forth kinds of arguments. There's a question about what the Shabbat farms are known for. They're not really known for anything. They don't really, they're just local farms that people would maintain. So probably wheat or, yeah. And especially since the fact that they're cut off from Shabbat, the Lebanese town, the area is just sort of non-used. The reason the Israelis don't want to give it up is because of its strategic position. The entire border between Lebanon and Syria, which Israel now controls because it controls the Syrian side of that border, is a mountainous territory. And so it gives Israel a good defense against Lebanon should Lebanon try to attack them. The last sort of Muslim realignment that we should talk about is the Druze ideological shift. And this is a particularly saddening case, but it sort of mirrors a lot of what we saw with Bashir Gemayel in his reevaluation of Marinism. And the Druze ideological shift switches from Kamal Jumblat, whose main view was that what he wanted to create was a democratic and secular project, right? The Druze are a very small minority within Lebanon. We're talking about less than 10% of the population. So they've generally advocated for secular policies because under a democratic system, they're simply not going to win the majority of votes. And if they try to create an authoritarian system, they'll probably be overthrown because they don't have a large enough constituency. But his son, Walid Jumblat, begins to increasingly contextualize the war against what he calls Marunistan, the country controlled by the president of Lebanon, and has this very strong Maronite perspective as a replay of the Druze Maronite conflict in the Lebanese Civil War of 1860, that the wars between Bashir Shihab II, the Maronite governor of Mount Lebanon, and Bashir Jumblat, who is his distant ancestor, that those conflicts are now going to be avenged. And in fact, he gets to Bashir Shihab's palace at Beit Din, which is still a cultural site in Lebanon today, and was a cultural site back then. And when he took this, in a way, he declared his victory over Bashir Shihab II, a person who'd been dead now for over 100 years, which should really show in many ways and how the Druze were reimagining the conflict that they were engaged in as actually a replay of a very different conflict with very different stakes and very different identities, and created a more sectarian lens through which to view the conflict than they had originally had. It also painted the Maronites as being ungrateful, that this had been a motif that the Druze had used throughout the 19th century, that the Druze had given the Maronites shelter and protection when other Muslims hadn't treated them the same way because of the Druze unique religious philosophy. And they allowed them to be sharecroppers. They allowed them to be serfs on the land in peace and in tranquility. And then in their arrogance, they rose up and took control. And so that arrogance was then laid into the modern Republic of Lebanon and its current presidential system in order to justify their wars against that system. Once we get to the later period and we have militia rule, we have this sort of divided and bifurcated system in Lebanon where all the different states are operating quasi-independently. And all these different states are very unique in terms of the tribal and other conflicts that we'll see elsewhere in the Arab world, think places like Iraq. And what makes these unique is that Lebanon is an entirely coastal country. And most of the hinterland regions, the ones that don't have access to the water, are connected to Syria anyway and are under Syrian occupation. So we're not really worried about those. But because there's so much sea frontage, basically every little militia becomes its own baby Singapore, in the sense of it becomes an import-export hub for its militia. It's able to bring in weapons from abroad. It's able to bring in supplies from abroad. And this allows the conflict to keep perpetuating. In fact, basically any part of the Lebanese coastline that was occupied by any militia of any kind effectively became a port during this period, allowing the conflict to keep going on. And we see that once these militias start to assert themselves, their general defense and raison d'etre is that they're protecting you from those others. And this rips at the national pact fabric of Lebanon as an idea of convivencia between different peoples. And instead, the militias promulgate the idea of, no, if you don't have me, insert religious sectarian group here, protecting you, those others will take you. Those others will kill you. Thankfully, we're here to protect you. Now let our gangs ransack the town. And even when they had managed to either create ethnically cleansed enclaves, or they had managed to expel many of the foreign, in their view, groups from their area, you then had contests between their own political power structures. Who would be the ones who would take power? Who would be the ones who would have to forfeit it? And there were also purity contests, in the sense of who's defending this cause more righteously, who's less willing to concede in all of these different conflicts. And so these groups become more and more and more estranged from reality. As we get to the period in the late 1980s, we have this Marunistan, right? This presidency controlled by the Maronites, increasingly besieged by the coalition that the Syrians had put together with the tripartite agreement. And, oh, that's unfortunate. Yeah, it's supposed to say Saddam Hussein under Saddam Hussein, but the last ruler of this Marunistan was Michel Aoun. And Michel Aoun was elected president in 1988 and the election took place primarily in the Mount Lebanon districts, the areas that were majority Maronite, because those were the areas under his direct control. The Syrians launched an all-out war against him from 1988 to 1990 in order to remove him and install their own system of Lebanese, led by Elias Hraoui, especially at the end of it, as president, and Salim al-Hos as the prime minister, right? Hraoui was a Maronite and Hos was a Sunni Muslim. And Michel Aoun, of course, was a Maronite as well. So this is actually a period in which Lebanon has, in theory, two different presidents and two different prime ministers from two different governments. The Syrians eventually proved successful, besieging Aoun at the Lebanese presidential palace at Ba'abda, and they force him to go into exile. He goes into exile to France. One important point to make about this is that Michel Aoun was not without his own allies. His strongest ally, ironically, was Saddam Hussein of Iraq. And you can sort of see how this is a mirror image of what Iran had been doing with Syria. Iran chose Syria to become an ally because he wanted to have a check on Iraq from the West. So Saddam Hussein became an ally of Michel Aoun to have a check on Syria from the West in order to box the Syrians in. And so you see this sort of politics that happened, and perhaps this can go to explaining how in 1990, the Syrians actually joined the coalition led by the Americans against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. So you have these sort of wars that are going on between these different parties that are using Lebanon as a proxy battlefield. Now, separate from the war against Marwan, the war against Aoun, you have a number of Lebanese leaders in Saudi Arabia coming up with what's called the Ta'if Agreement, because it was signed in the city of Ta'if in Saudi Arabia. And the Ta'if Agreement looks suspiciously similar to the Tripartite Agreement. There are a few differences, but by and large, it follows many of the same contours, especially the fact that Muslims and Christians would be equally represented in the parliament. A number of districts were reallocated, and a lot of the prerogatives of the president were shifted to the prime minister, meaning that the Maronites would lose a significant degree of power in this new arrangement. And it was one of the reasons why Aoun refused to accept it when it was passed. But the parliament under Elias Harawi approved it anyway. And with Michel Aoun in exile, this effectively ended the Lebanese civil war under Syrian auspices, because the Syrians were the ones who forced Aoun out. There was no requirement under the Ta'if Agreement for them to leave. And since Hezbollah was still fighting the resistance against Israel, there was no requirement for Hezbollah to disarm either. And so the Syrians signed the Treaty for Brotherhood, Cooperation, and Coordination with the Lebanese on the 5th of November, 1989. It is as laughably one-sided as one could imagine, and effectively turned Lebanon into a Syrian satellite state. There are a couple things that can be pointed out that sort of show this more obviously than others. The first one is that, as I mentioned, Michel Aoun and his family were in exile. Michel Aoun happened to be a French citizen, and so he requested asylum at the French embassy, and he was eventually brought to France. One of the ironies of the Ta'if Agreement is that it provided immunity for nearly all of the massive number of crimes that had occurred during the Lebanese Civil War, massacres of civilians here or there. There was one person for whom, though, the Syrians provided no clemency, and that was Samir Geagea. Geagea was a leader of the Lebanese forces by the time that Michel Aoun was making his last stands, and accordingly, he was not part of the group that approved the Ta'if Agreement and was not part of the reconciliation that was imagined thereby. And so the Lebanese government, at Syrian urging, put him under solitary confinement for the rest of his life. Now, of course, that would be overturned in the Cedar Revolution, but at this point, we didn't know that. He was publicly put on trial for an atrocity that he entirely did commit. The only reason that it was disproportionate in any way is that other leaders who had committed equally horrible atrocities were not similarly committed. Now, one of the things that we learned about Syria when we talked about them in the previous two, in episode 71 and 72, is that the Syrians had an extensive deuxième bureau, or intelligence services, and they extended that approach to Lebanon. In fact, when they conquered Ababda Palace from Michel Aoun, they confiscated all of his files on intelligence matters in Lebanon in order to be able to operate themselves. And they built a number of torture facilities in Lebanon for dissidents. But in many cases, the harshest punishments were not done in Lebanon. Soldiers from Lebanese Front and other groups that they deemed to be dissidents, be they journalists, politicians, wealthy entrepreneurs, were sent to Syrian prisons where they were tortured and beaten in a rather merciless and brutal fashion. In this way, Syria could control the politics and the policy within Lebanon. And the Ta'if Agreement is on paper the creation of a democracy. And so you have this very weird situation where you have voting, and it's not just voting for one political party. There are multiple different political parties that are in operation in Lebanon during the Syrian period. And so it looks like a democracy in the sense of you have different political parties with different political aims. Most of them share certain aims, but especially as far as alliance with Syria is concerned. But there are a lot of choice to personal issues. So you have this weird manufactured democracy. And the man who oversees this is Ghazi Kanaan. And Kanaan is an ex-official within the Syrian government. He's sent to Lebanon in 1989 to coordinate the implementation of this Syrian takeover. And he makes his view on what Lebanese politics should look like very clear. In fact, in reference to the Treaty of Brotherhood, Coordination and Cooperation. In that, he basically says that the role of the Lebanese is to create an economy, that they're great economic powers, and that accordingly, what they should be doing is building a new economic space, but they should leave difficult questions of security and organization and politics to the Syrians. In fact, you had leaders like Jamila Sayed, who was the head of the Sûreté Générale, or the Inspectorate General in Lebanon. And in many cases, instead of giving his reports to the president of Lebanon or the prime minister of Lebanon, he would give them to Kanaan, effectively giving all of the military knowledge of the country to the Syrians. You also had Kanaan working with different politicians, scoping out different regions, making sure that although the elections were free and fair from the perspective of people weren't coerced necessarily to vote for who they wouldn't otherwise vote for, that they had no choice but to vote for the candidates that Kanaan wanted to see in the parliament. And so you have this weird situation where the democracy is itself a farce. Now, separate from not intimidating local voters, he absolutely did intimidate politicians. During the Syrian period, you had numerous assassinations by any politician that was deemed to have ventured too far from an acceptable Syrian line. And so the politicians that became very successful during this period were effectively Syrian lapdogs. Probably the most famous of these is Emil Lahoud, who was president from 1998 to 2004. And as is tradition in Lebanon, after one term of presidency, he was supposed to leave. But the Syrians pushed for an amendment to the Lebanese constitution, which would allow him to run again because they liked how effectively he worked for them. Many in the Lebanese parliament objected, even those that had been general supporters of the Syrian regime, in particular Rafiq Hariri. Hariri was a Sunni and a wealthy businessman, probably the wealthiest man in Lebanon while he was alive. And he was assassinated in 2004. Sorry, he was assassinated in 2005 because even though he eventually permitted the amendment, and that's why Lahoud had a second term from 2004 to 2007, he objected to the amendment at first blush because it was a violation of the system of Lebanon and a clear overreach of Syria beyond the kind of manufacturing of the democracy that Kanaan had engaged in. And so this antipathy towards the Syrians really built up because of the security state apparatus and the fact that Israel had withdrawn by May of 2000. And so because Israel had withdrawn from southern Lebanon, the reason for the Syrians to be there, for the protection of Lebanon, for the national security, seemed to sort of evaporate away. And so when Rafiq Hariri was assassinated on the 14th of February in 2005, nearly 1 million Lebanese took to the streets demanding that the Syrians get out now. There had also been a number of UN Security Council resolutions, especially Resolution 1559, demanding that all forces leave Lebanon. But of course, since this was issued in 2004, the only foreign forces in Lebanon were those of Syria. Bashar al-Assad, the new president of Syria, surprised everybody when within a few months, he actually made all the Syrians leave. And at least on the face of it, gave Lebanon their independence back. The protests seem to have been largely successful. But the thing is that the Syrians had left behind a number of their own elements in the country to continue to direct policy. Probably the most important of them were the Shiite coalition members that they had created in the form of Hezbollah and Amal. Now, Amal was not a Syrian creation, as we pointed out, but Amal had a long relationship with Syria starting in 1973. And Hezbollah was created by both Syria and Iran in Lebanon in order to enforce their policies. And since Lebanon was still armed, it was the only militia that was still armed in Lebanon, it posed a direct threat to the Lebanese national government in a way that no other former militia did, because all of those were forcibly disarmed. One of the demands of the Cedar Revolution was that Hezbollah disarm, and Hezbollah still argued that because of the Shabab Farms controversy, that Israel was still controlling Lebanese territory, and therefore it was not required to let go of its arms. And so, in the wake of the Cedar Revolution, we have two coalitions that really form: a March 8th coalition and a March 14th coalition. And these coalition names are very confusing, I find, for most people, because it's a number and not a word or an idea. So I'm going to simplify it a little bit and say that the March 14th coalition is a pro-West coalition. It's a coalition that seeks to identify Lebanon with the Western states. It seeks to identify with secular Sunni states or Western aligned Sunni states like Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Egypt. And it wants better relations with Turkey, groups like that. And a pro-Syrian contingent, which is the March 8th Alliance. And they want to have a stronger relationship with Syria and Iran. So I'm going to call them the pro-West faction and the pro-Syrian faction. And one of the things I want to draw attention to between the pro-West faction and the pro-Syrian faction is that they cover different sectarian aspects of the society. The Future Movement is a Sunni Muslim political party, and the Arab Democratic Party and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, all three of those are Sunnis, but you see them split between the different sides. The Progressive Socialist Party is Druze, which generally tend to align with Shiites in terms of their historical policy. But the Shiites are part of the pro-Syria alliance. You have the Hezbollah and the Amal movement. And of course, the March 14th alliance would not be complete without the Lebanese Front. That's the successor to the forces of the Gemayels and Jaja. On the Maronite side, they're part of that pro-Western group, which makes total sense. But then you also have the Free Patriotic Movement, which is Michel Aoun and his successors, who decided to be on the pro-Syrian side despite fighting heavily against Syria in the 1980s. And the reason that Michel Aoun says that he started joining the pro-Syrian side is that he felt that the West, as much as he would have wanted it to be an ally of Lebanon, is just not interested in Lebanon. It's interested in Israel at Lebanon's expense, or it's interested in oil in the Gulf region at Lebanon's expense. And so the Maronites need to find local allies with whom they can create a meaningful long-term impact and not become culturally eliminated, as Christians have been, at least in his view, in Israel-Palestine and in Iraq and in other places where Westerners have intervened. By contrast, the Future Movement, which probably should have been on the pro-Syrian side because it was Sunni, and the Sunnis had that historical relationship with Syria throughout the Palestinian period and onwards. But the Future Movement was alienated by the murder of Rafiq Hariri and other Sunni politicians by the Syrians, and so they felt that the Syrians wouldn't respect Lebanese independence and Lebanese self-determination, and so they wanted a closer rapprochement with the West, which might permit that. And so you see all these different groups taking positions that you might not expect from a sectarian perspective, but you have to understand from a localized power play perspective. In the midst of all of these problems, Hezbollah crosses the border into Israel in 2006 to kidnap 2 Israeli soldiers, Regev and Goldwasser, and bring them across the border into Lebanon. Israel responds by launching a massive bombing raid of Lebanon and trying to attack Hezbollah strongholds south of the Litani River. These bombing attacks are incredibly destructive to Lebanon and lead to thousands of civilian casualties. But for the most part, the Lebanese military was powerless to actually intervene in the conflict. The conflict was between Hezbollah using Soviet-made weapons like Katyushas given to them by the Iranians and Israeli military forces, with Lebanese civilians basically being caught in the crossfire as Hezbollah operated out of a number of villages. It was a feeling of total powerlessness among the Lebanese that there was literally nothing that they could do from the position of maintaining their own internal security. And as the Syrians had already left and were not coming back, Hezbollah saw itself as the guarantor of Lebanese security, and a number of Lebanese took that perspective as well. At the same time, we see increasing moves for and against Hezbollah in the wider Lebanese schema. Probably the most angering one to Hezbollah itself was the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon. This was a UN-created investigative agency that was going to look into the death of Rafiq Hariri, which many Lebanese, especially on the pro-Western side, considered to be a Syrian-led assassination, like a number of the assassinations that had occurred before, especially considering how it happened in close proximity to his refusal to amend the constitution. You also had, so as a result of that, Hezbollah and Amal, the 2 Shiite members of the coalition, stepped out of a number of the leadership committees. They resigned their posts. Now, under the Lebanese constitution, if there aren't Shiite members in sufficient numbers, that make quora, these organizations are defunct. And so they demanded Fouad Siniora, who was the prime minister, the Sunni prime minister at the time, to call for a new appointment of those ministries, and he refused, seeing this whole thing as a cheap trick. Accordingly, Hezbollah and Amal rallied their supporters to begin to camp out outside of the Capitol building and launch a number of protests against the government of Siniora. Among these protests, and these protests were coordinated, at least at their start, with an assassination, the assassination of Pierre Amin Gemayel. This is the son of Amin Gemayel, the former president in 1983. And his assassination made it very clear to those on the pro-Western coalition that Hezbollah was going to act in its own interests over Lebanon. Now, from the position of Hezbollah, its interests are the Lebanese interests. And Fouad Siniora was representing interests in opposite to Lebanon, trying to sow division by permitting a court that would likely indict Syria to reach a verdict that would alienate a significant portion of the Lebanese people and force Lebanon outside of the Syrian orbit. And so tensions began to increasingly rise throughout the year of 2007 between Siniora and other members of the pro-West leaning coalition and members of the pro-Syrian coalition. What finally was the spark that started actual conflict in 2008 was that Walid Jumblat, who was part of the Druze representatives of the pro-Western coalition, noticed that one of the airport strips that pro-Western politicians often used for their travel was monitored by a hidden camera used by Hezbollah. Now, that on its own is not a problem. But when you consider the fact that a number of anti-Syrian politicians had been assassinated, knowing the comings and goings of these politicians and directly relaying it to a militia that still carries weapons was seen as a direct affront. And so Fouad Siniora demanded that Hezbollah take down its military communications network and stop using that communications network to monitor the comings and goings of Lebanese politicians with whom it might Hezbollah's response to the attempted dismantling of its network was to attack Beirut on the 7th of May in 2008. And this almost descended into another civil war. Sheikh Hamad ibn Khalifa al-Thani of Qatar called all the sides of the civil war to meet in Doha with the intent of coming to a solution. And the solution that they came to was the appointment of a new president, Michel Suleiman, but Hezbollah was still allowed to keep its arms. The basic premise was that neither party would claim victory from this altercation. Hezbollah would still be allowed to be a political party, still be allowed to be armed, but at the same time, Fouad Siniora would not be forced to resign his post as prime minister. And things would continue as if nothing had changed. And in many ways, a lot of pro-Western Lebanese see this as the nail in the coffin of Lebanese democracy, arguing that because Hezbollah was now able to overthrow the power of the state, and the Doha Agreement effectively solidified their ability to launch military coups against a state that they didn't like, that they would effectively have control. Pro-Syrians would argue that Michel Suleiman was a neutral candidate. He was somebody who had bona fides on both the pro-Western and pro-Syrian sides. And there have been elections since this point in which the pro-Western Future Movement, for example, has been able to broker a coalition, like in 2018. So it's not the case, necessarily, that Hezbollah has complete control of the country. During this entire Hezbollah escalation from 2006 to 2008, there was also an issue with the remaining Palestinians. Now, while the PLO left in 1983, the Palestinian civilian population stayed. And so Lebanon today has about 400,000 Palestinian refugees. A militant organization called Fatah al-Islam, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, launched a revolt in Lebanon when Lebanese security forces tried to confiscate their weapons. And this resulted in a pitched battle between Fatah al-Islam and the Lebanese army. You had attacks on Lebanese civilians throughout the country as the primary way by which Fatah al-Islam tried to compel the Lebanese security forces to leave them alone, like you can see there at the Junia Mall. They even attacked the United Nations Force for Lebanon, UNIFIL, at the checkpoint in Al Khaim, killing Spanish soldiers. But the majority of the deaths and the majority of the violence occurred around Nahr al-Barid. Nahr al-Barid, or Cold River, is one of several Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. Another one, Ain al-Halwa, or Well of the Beautiful, I guess you could say, were sites where the Lebanese security forces directly interacted with Fatah al-Islam. They bombed and shelled the areas of the refugee camp, killing a number of Palestinians. And over the course of the 4 or so months of conflict, what ended up happening was that Fatah al-Islam was completely eradicated from Lebanon. But in the meantime, over 1,000 Palestinians lost their lives, civilians, as a result of the violence and attacks. Now, there's a question as to whether the Doha Agreement with the Taliban and the Doha Agreement in this case in 2008, why they were both hosted in Doha. And it's not a coincidence so much as it is Qatar's unique portfolio. Qatar has sort of an open door policy to everybody but Israel in the Middle East and North Africa region. So they have US military bases and they have Taliban embassies and they have representatives of Hamas and they have representatives of Fatah. And then they have they basically allow everybody to negotiate with everybody within their borders, and that's sort of how they wish to operate. Now, some of their neighbors, like Saudi Arabia, have seen that as a little bit too friendly with Iran. Some others that are more Iranian aligned see that as too friendly to Iran's enemies, like the Taliban. So you have this sort of situation, but because of that collegiality that Doha allows for, it's a place where these sort of ceasefire negotiations can be hammered out. So we've talked a lot about the Arab Spring in Syria, and the Arab Spring in Lebanon in many ways was a reflection of what happened in Syria. And so as long as we remember that there was this convulsing war with multiple different sides, then what happens in Lebanon makes a lot more sense. We have a strong connection between Syria and Lebanon, even with the Syrian military withdrawal. And part of that connection meant that the Arab Spring as a protest movement also occurred in Lebanon. Although the protests in Lebanon were not for example, Asqat al-Nizam, right, down with the system, which is what we see in Egypt, what we see in Syria. The Lebanese were actually pretty happy with their democracy in the sense of they liked the system, they just thought it had flaws. And so their primary issue was those flaws. And so we have this resurgence of the Third Republic option again, that Lebanon should abandon its sectarian system and become a republic that's based on pure democracy, that people vote for who they want in power, and it's not constrained by sect or by creed. A lot of youngsters, even on the Christian side, feel like this would be more effective because in many cases, the democracy has allowed the Zu'ama, or these Zaims, these historical landowners, who were the heads of the various militias, to basically retain power because there are so few people competing over so few seats, and only certain people can be elected to certain seats because of the ethnic qualifiers, that effectively these groups remain in power indefinitely and there's no end to their corruption. If there's a way for people to vote for new blood to enter the government, then they can effectively resolve their own problems. And so you have these anti-sectarian protests going on. You can get rid of the sectarianism and therefore achieve real progress. On the flip side, you have those who would argue that the sectarianism is what has prevented Lebanon from descending into the chaos that we've seen in a lot of other countries where sectarian conflict comes out into the open. So as a result, these protests remained mostly peaceful. There wasn't any military attempt to crack down on them or otherwise defeat them. Where the military did crack down was when al-Nusra, which is Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a Syrian division of Al-Qaeda, crossed the border into Lebanon and began to try and turn Lebanon into part of its controlled territories. At this point, both Hezbollah and the Lebanese security forces worked together in order to expel Jabhat al-Nusra from Lebanon, and that was largely successful in 2012 and 2013. There are still some parts of Lebanon that are Salafist, including areas where large numbers of Syrian refugees have crossed over. But these areas are generally stamped out, and by 2018, there weren't any more holdouts of jihadist or Islamist influence within Lebanon, outside of those that are already in established government parties. Now, when we talk about the Syrian refugees, we have to understand how inundated Lebanon is. Lebanon had a pre-Syrian war population of 4.4 million, includes 400,000 Palestinians. The amount of Syrians that have entered Lebanon is about 1.5 million. And to put that in perspective, based on what is going on with the population of the United States, that would be as if 80 million people immigrated to the United States in about 2 years. In about 10 years. And that has never happened. Our entire immigration, for example, in the last 40 years, since 1965, is around 50 million. So that should put into perspective just how overwhelming this immigration is. And of course, it's in the areas closest to the Syrian border. Areas like the Bekaa Valley, areas like the northern region. And a lot of these Syrians either want to work or want to be productive, but from the Lebanese system, if they were to grant citizenship or working papers to a lot of these Syrians, it could again upset the demographic balance. And so Lebanon is sort of stuck between these two cores of what it can and should do. It's also worth putting into perspective that Lebanon, with accepting 1.5 million refugees, has accepted more refugees than any single European country. And of course, that is incredibly culturally and socially destabilizing. There are a few other things that I want to sort of point out before we sort of close our story on Lebanon. There's a question of, do the Syrians ever venture east to Georgia or Russia? Well, in order for them to get to Georgia or Russia, they'd have to go through Turkey. But generally speaking, they don't go to Georgia, because if they're already making the trip through Turkey, the better way for them to go is west towards Europe. They expect that they'll receive better treatment in Europe than they would in Russia. So that's sort of the thought process there. Now, there's a very strange situation that happens concerning Saad Hariri. And Saad Hariri, as I pointed out, is a member of the Future Movement. So his coalition is naturally pro-Western. But in 2017, he met with a number of Iranian representatives, because Iran and Lebanon do still have strong relations. Remember, the pro-Syrian party is often part of the government, even if it's not part of the ruling coalition. And Lebanon maintains strong relations with Syria and Iran because of that historic relationship. And that relationship, however, looked a little too close for Saudi Arabia's liking. And so they requested that Saad al-Hariri come to their territory. Now, Saad al-Hariri, of course, we should mention, is the son of Rafiq Hariri. So you have to imagine how awkward or difficult it is for him to sit across from people who likely had some say in the murder of his father. But as Iran is a natural player in the environment, he has to, talk to them. And when he arrived in Saudi Arabia, it's reported that Saudi officials stormed the plane, arrested him, and then forced him to resign his role as prime minister on national television. The Lebanese government refused to accept this resignation, because this resignation, there's a question of whether Hariri received generational wealth. He absolutely did. His father, Rafiq Hariri, was one of the wealthiest people in all of Lebanon, and Saad inherited most of that. But so Hariri declared that he was resigning the presidency, and the Lebanese government refused to accept it. At this point, Michel Aoun, who had become part of that pro-Syrian coalition, was president. And from his perspective, it didn't make sense. Hezbollah, a pro-Iranian party, a pro-Syrian party as well, also refused to accept the resignation, because in their view, it was from Saudi coercion. Now, in al-Hariri's speech, which totally does not look like it was forced after torture or beating, al-Hariri said that Iranians were compelling him to take a more pro-Iranian perspective and isolate the Saudis, which is why he felt that he would no longer be able to steward the country in a pro-Western direction. Eventually, al-Hariri was removed from Saudi Arabia and able to restore his position as prime minister in Lebanon. But this sort of debacle definitely puts a crimp in relations between the Saudis and the Lebanese. And in fact, Hezbollah declared war on Saudi Arabia as a result of this, launching a missile from Yemen at Riyadh. While Saudi Arabia and Lebanon didn't ever actually get to a direct war beyond these sort of tit-for-tat actions, it underscored the need, at least in the perspective of many Lebanese, to maintain their pro-Iranian alliance. Now, one of the strange aspects of Middle Eastern politics is that people who hate each other surprisingly make great bedfellows. So 1 year later, you can see Saad al-Hariri with Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi monarch who imprisoned him, in Paris, taking a selfie together as part of al-Hariri's selfie diplomacy, where he takes selfies with other world leaders. It's a little bizarre, but Lebanon. Another piece that we should sort of address is that Lebanon's economy, especially with the COVID situation, is in a massive downward spiral. In 2017, you had the 17th of October protests, which were about the failure of the economy to really adjust or develop in any meaningful way for most Lebanese. And this was compounded by the liquidity crisis, which started in 2017, but really became apparent in 2019, where Lebanese banks were unable to guarantee the value of Lebanese currency. And so the Lebanese currency became increasingly worthless. At this point, 80% of Lebanese are considered poor by international standards. And there doesn't seem to be any real movement from the government in any meaningful way to address the crisis. Originally, Lebanon was able to use dollars to help inflate its economy, but that required taking an immense amount of national debt, and that debt has finally gone without release. Another sort of show of the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of the Lebanese government is the Beirut port explosion. So this was a case where a Moldovan carrier was supposed to go through the Suez Canal, but for whatever reason, they didn't have enough money to go through the Suez Canal. And so the thought was that they would take on additional cargo in Beirut in order to pay for the difference to go through the canal. But during that time, the ship owner went into default. And so the cargo was impounded in Lebanon as part of a way of extracting the toll fees for just leaving your ship in the dock. And so that happened in 2014. And despite numerous letters from the Beirut Port Authority arguing that significant amounts of ammonium nitrate leave the possibility of massive explosion, nothing was done until there was a massive explosion. 218 people died, over 5,000 people had injuries of varying degrees, and people have become increasingly dissatisfied, if they weren't before, with the inability of the government to make meaningful changes, regardless of whether it's pro-Syrians in control, as is the case now, or it was pro-Westerners in control, as it was in 2017. And it seems like the judiciary, which is the one that impounded the ship and did not respond to any of the letters from the Port Authority talking about the issue, will not have a thorough investigation of its judges as a result of this problem. There's a question of when MBS detained Hariri. Did he ask for money as a bounty? I know he's trying to fund Neom. He didn't ask Hariri for any money. What he wanted from Hariri was basically a distancing of Lebanon from Iran. He felt that Lebanon was too close in the Iranian sphere, and so he wanted Lebanon to be more Western aligned, Saudi aligned, in the proxy war that he's been fighting with Iran. He was trying to fund Neom, but he wasn't trying to attract Saad Hariri's money through this. All right, so that finishes modern Lebanon. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. And while we're waiting for those, I will address a little bit about who we are. This is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard, and tonight you have listened to Middle Eastern Islamic history. We will return next week on Wednesday to talk about Jordan and the development of modern Jordan. Of course, our group also does Asian philosophy with Jason Peng. Aaron and I are going to do a Ukraine episode in the beginning of June, which is very exciting. We have episodes of Powerful Women and Dead Languages coming up this month, so stay tuned for those. And of course, we have other older series that you can see on our YouTube page. So I have one question here that I wanted to sort of push off. If this is another episode, ignore this question. What qualities made Lebanon the Paris of the Middle East? I sort of addressed this a little bit earlier, but it was the Paris of the Middle East because it was westernized to an extent that Westerners felt like they could travel there. It was a luxury place that for people from the Middle East to come, especially people from more repressive or more conservative governments like the ones in the Gulf. It had an effective banking structure, which made it attractive from a business perspective, for both from the Arab world and from Europe. And because of the immense amount of trade flowing through Beirut, it had a constant generation of wealth. The destruction of the banking industry basically led to the collapse of this entire system. There's a question if Afghanistan is covered in my series. I've debated whether I want to do or not do an Afghanistan, a few Afghanistan episodes. There is mention of Afghanistan in some of the episodes, like in the Shadow of Nadir Shah, I think. So I think that's episode 37 or 38. And in the Shadow of Nadir Shah, I talk about the Durrani Empire, which is an Afghan state. By and large, Afghanistan stays outside of my series, but that's neither here nor there. With Lebanon's recent economic collapse, what was the catalyst for the rapid decline? Corruption. Corruption is certainly a part of it. I would say that the bigger aspect of it is that there's no motivation for the government to improve things, because the way the Lebanese voting works, it basically results in the same people coming to power in various different iterations. There's always some new blood, but the party leaders and the organizations are pretty much the same and have been since the Cedar Revolution of 2005. So none of those people has a real incentive to improve the situation. And the other major issue is that Hezbollah effectively has a military veto over any government that forms. So if governments want to, for example, create a unified use of force, like a modern nation state would have, they'll spark another civil war, which Lebanon can't take. Also, you had massive brain drain because of the civil war. So a lot of the people surviving in the country are not the ones who would be the most effective in repairing it. You have a number of these sort of systemic issues, and there's really just not a good conversation about how to fix it beyond we should end sectarianism, which is a non-starter for about a third of the population because of the fact that they'd be afraid that they'd be persecuted if sectarianism were to end. So in my view, it's Lebanese failing to address the problem they do have and trying to address problems that are secondary. All right, thank you everyone for the kind words, and I will see everyone next week then.